I was especially pleased when I heard that the theme of the TEDx conference this weekend was going to be you might not realize. And that's because there's many things you might not realize about the sort of thing that I study, organized violence in our world, things like war and ethnic conflict and even genocide. And maybe that's not so surprising, actually, when you think about it, because our society is amazingly insulated from this kind of violence, even though that's not true in many other parts of the world. Think about it. Right now, the United States is involved in 2 separate wars, but most of the fighting and dying and killing is happening thousands of miles away from here, where we don't see it. We have 200,000 men and women fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan right now, and that might seem like a lot, but that adds up to just about 0.06% of the American population. And partly because we've been so insulated from this kind of violence, I don't think we pay very much attention to it, especially when it's happening in other parts of the world. So if I were to ask you to name the most violent conflict of the last 20 years, how many of you would have been able to name the conflict, the civil war that happened in Congo, in Central Africa, from 1998 to 2003? That conflict killed between 2 and 4 million people, which is 5 to 10 times more than died in the genocide in Darfur. In fact, another thing people don't tend to realize when it comes to this kind of organized violence is that actually most of it doesn't occur during war. And most of it's not targeted against soldiers, but instead against innocent civilians. So in fact, by my estimate, about 100 million civilians have died in episodes of intentional violence against civilian populations. And that compares, in the last 100 years, and that compares to about 40 million soldiers who've died in all the wars of the 20th century and first 10 years of the 21st century combined. And because we're so removed from this kind of violence, I think even those of us who do pay attention and maybe got some of those earlier questions right, sometimes suffer from some pretty serious misconceptions about why it happens. So if you ask Americans, why did countries like Rwanda, Sudan, or Bosnia descend into genocide and mass killing, the answer you get is pretty simple. People in those countries simply hated each other. And it's not just the public that tends to see things this way. In fact, when Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger was asked in 1992 if he could explain why Bosnia had then descended into genocide and ethnic violence, he said pretty much the same thing. He said, "There's no rationality at all about ethnic conflict. It's gut, it's hatred, it's not for any common set of values or purposes. It just goes on." Now, this story about the causes of mass violence, I think, is an easy one to understand, makes a lot of sense. But there's a real problem with looking for the causes of mass violence in hatred between groups in society. And it's not that problem. The problem isn't that people in places like Rwanda or Yugoslavia didn't hate each other, because of course they did. The problem is that if you look around the world, you can almost always find groups that hate each other in almost every society, right? And just because you hate somebody, it doesn't mean that you have to kill them. In fact, if you begin to think about all the different ethnic groups, social groups that exist in all the different societies around the world, conflict between those groups starts to look quite rare, let alone full-scale genocide. Now, we tend to think about these hatreds or attitudes as something that maybe only exists in the uncivilized world, right? It's not something that we think about here in Western developed democracies. But in fact, when you see a set of polls like this, you see that attitude itself is probably ethnocentric, the idea that it's only them that have these kinds of hatreds and attitudes about minority groups, right? Disrespect and the thought that minority groups are inferior, that exists here just as much as almost anywhere else. Still, despite these really depressing poll numbers, I don't think a lot of people are particularly worried about an impending genocide of Albanians, say, in Italy. It's just not something we're worried about. Why not? Because the fact of the matter is that these kinds of attitudes are simply too common to be the main cause of something as uncommon as genocide or mass killing. Well, maybe it's just that the attitudes have to be more widespread and more intense in the societies where we see this kind of violence than in the societies where we don't. And that's an interesting hypothesis, too. Seems to make some sense. But when you begin to look at the places where this kind of violence happens, what's so surprising is, in many ways, they don't look all that different from other multi-ethnic societies. Places where different ethnic groups maybe didn't get along very well, but nevertheless managed to coexist without killing each other in huge numbers. In fact, another thing you might not realize is that if you look at intermarriage rates, places like Rwanda and Yugoslavia, prior to when the violence broke out, those intermarriage rates were higher there between victims and perpetrators than they are between African Americans and whites today in the United States. Maybe even more revealing when we think about it this way is the cases of mass violence that we can see happening in countries where there's really little history of hatred or discrimination between the groups that fell on either side of the violence. And maybe the best examples here are the mass killings that took place in communist countries in the 20th century, places like the Soviet Union or China or Cambodia. Again, another thing people don't realize, these were the bloodiest episodes of mass killing in human history. Just those three countries probably account for about 50 million dead in 3 countries alone. Almost all we're talking about civilians killed outside of war, civil war. So again, doesn't seem like in these countries where the victims were not primarily from different ethnic groups, but instead were members of the same social, ethnic, and cultural groups as their killers, that hatred could really be the explanation. In fact, tens of thousands of victims in each of those countries came from the Communist Party itself, right? Hard to say that it was pre-existing differences that caused that violence. Now, if you think about it, the converse is also true of this story. We could think about lots of societies that existed for long periods of time with relatively intense levels of hatred and discrimination within them, but still didn't result in large-scale violence. And maybe the best example of this, I think, comes from our own not-too-distant past. In this country, take the Jim Crow-era South, right? I think that's got to be, by almost any objective measure, one of the most openly racist societies that existed during the 20th century. Remember, this is a place where blacks and whites can't use the same bathrooms, can't ride on buses next to each other, can't sit at the same lunch counter, and of course, where blacks are routinely denied the right to vote, despite being citizens of this country. You have to see that's much, much worse, actually, than the way things would have looked if you'd looked at Yugoslavia in the 1980s, before the genocide there, or in Rwanda in the 1980s, before the genocide there. None of this kind of stuff was happening in those places, yet they saw violence. And we saw, of course, not a very peaceful society. We wouldn't call the Jim Crow-era South one of the most peaceful parts of American history, but no organized mass violence on the scale that I've been talking about. Now, of course, these are just some historical examples I've been giving you, but when we look across all countries at the same time using sort of large cross-national statistical studies, we find pretty much the same thing, that all of our measures of ethnic differences in society don't correlate well with whether the country ultimately has a mass killing or genocide or whether it does not. So now you might be asking yourself, why not? Because it does seem like common sense, doesn't it? That where we would expect mass violence to take place between groups is in the sickest societies, those with the deepest cultural, ethnic, religious divisions between groups. Well, I think the reason that these seemingly common sense factors really don't tell us that much about where violence occurs and where it might not is because of another thing you might not realize about this kind of conflict, and that is, unfortunately, mass violence is simply much easier to carry out than most of us think. Most of us probably imagine, when you think about violence on the scale of what happened in a place like Yugoslavia or Darfur or Cambodia, that this was half of society turning on the other half, right? How else could that conflict have been so amazingly bloody? But actually, when you begin to look closely, you see that assumption is wrong. Violence like this is almost never that neighbor-killing neighbor story that we read about so often in the press, or that occupies our minds when we think about this kind of violence. On the contrary, the more you look closely at how this violence is carried out, the more you realize that it's carried out by shockingly small numbers of people, usually specialists in violence, people who are in the military or paramilitary groups, or sometimes groups who are specifically recruited from criminal gangs or groups of thugs, right, because they don't have moral scruples about killing innocent men, women, and children. All told, these groups almost never make up more than about 1 or 2% of the adult male population in the countries where mass violence takes place. And just put that in a little perspective for you. In the United States today, about 5% of the adult male population is currently in jail or on probation, right? So less than that is what it takes to carry out mass violence. Let me give you a couple examples here from the real world so you can see how this happens. Here we have Cambodia. Cambodia in 1975, the Khmer Rouge took power. At that time, they numbered about 70,000 soldiers and an additional 1,000 or so political cadre, the people who told those soldiers who to kill, right? They took control of a country of 8 million people, and 4 years later, 2 million of those people were dead. At the most infamous Khmer Rouge political prison, a place called S21, there were about 300 people working there, not all of them even involved in violence, some of them simply overseeing the violence. Yet at that one prison, 14,000 people were killed, most of them in the space of less than 2 years. In Yugoslavia, this group was one of the most feared armed gangs in the war. Archon's Tigers, they were called. And they probably killed several thousand people on their own and ethnically cleansed tens of thousands of additional people. Yet again, most estimates of Archon's group suggest that he never had more than about 500, at most 1,000 people working for him at any given time. Lastly, these are the Janjaweed, the infamous group responsible for most of the violence in Darfur today. Probably killed about 500,000 people and ethnically cleansed 3 million people during the course of that war. But again, the Janjaweed probably never numbered more than about 20,000. That's less than 0.1% of the population of Sudan. So if all that's right, then it's probably a mistake to go around trying to generalize from what these people did, right, and what they thought and felt, to what was happening in the rest of society. There's no more reason to believe that they're representative of the societies in which they acted than our prison population is representative of our societies. So now you might be asking yourself, how can such small groups cause so much trouble? How can they be responsible for so much bloodshed? The thing to keep in mind here is that when we're talking about mass killing as opposed to traditional warfare between groups, the balance in numbers between perpetrators and victims really doesn't matter that much. Because here we're talking about one-sided violence. And when the perpetrators don't have to worry about defending themselves from the other side, then the numbers of people that they can kill just boils down to a mathematical calculation, a simple one, right? How many killers are there? How long do they have? And how quickly do they do their work? And if you begin to think about that mathematical calculation, the numbers add up pretty quickly. So if there were just 10,000 killers, each of them killed just 2 victims a week, at the end of a year, that would be more than 1 million people killed. And so if that's true, then what we really want to ask ourselves is not why some societies devolve into mass killing and genocide and some don't, because mass killing and genocide might not be something that societies as a whole even do. It's not a broad social phenomenon. And that's where we want to ask ourselves instead, why is it that some groups or societies are better able to keep the small, radical, unrepresentative groups who actually do this violence in check, while some cannot? So the title of my talk came from a famous quote by Edmund Burke. Those of you who don't know, Edmund Burke is a British statesman and political theorist, and he has this very famous quote, which I think speaks to what I've been saying. He says, "When bad men combine, the good must associate, or else they will fall, one by one, an unpitied sacrifice in a contemptible struggle." So the problem, in other words, when we think about this kind of violence, is not that the bad men outnumber the good men. It's that the bad men are better armed and better organized than the good ones are. And so maybe this perspective can also help us understand why it is that small groups of bad men, like, say, these guys, don't manage to do more damage than they already do in our society or other societies like ours, right? It's not because they don't have enough numbers. Today, the KKK probably numbers about 5,000 individuals in the United States. At their peak in the 1920s, over 2 million people were members of the KKK. So if you believe what I've been telling you, that's more than enough to do an astonishing amount of bloodshed if they were unopposed. But of course, in the United States today, groups like this are opposed by the military, the police, the National Guard. And they stopped these groups from doing what they might otherwise do if they were left to their own devices. Now, in places like Yugoslavia or Rwanda or Sudan, it's not as if everybody who was a member of those societies was a member of the Klan. That's the mistake, right? They weren't members of the equivalent of the Klan. That's the mistake we make. But it was as if the Ku Klux Klan controlled the government and the military and the police, and there was nobody else to stand in their way, right? And if that's right, then what the bad men need from us, they don't need us to participate in the violence. They don't even need our sympathy for it, right? All they need is for us to stand aside and let it happen. And I think it's here that actually those everyday hatreds, stereotypes, and discrimination that I talked about at the beginning of this talk begin to come into play, right? Because while those hatreds aren't enough to get us to rise up and kill our neighbor, they might be more than enough to prevent us from rising up to protect our neighbors from the small groups of determined bad men who actually do the killing in these kinds of cases. Thanks.